In the first part of this lesson, I explained how the economic process of industrialization happened earlier and faster in Britain than in France. In the second part now, I will explain how the demographic, social, geographical impacts of industrialization affected the two countries, again not at the same pace and not with the same intensity, and that this affected mostly the cities but also indirectly the countryside, just thus changing the societies and the countries from rural ones to urban ones. And so again, let's have a look at these two very contrasted situations. So on this graph, the data is about the urban rate in each country, which means the percentage of people living in cities as opposed to people living in the countryside. And we see on this graph that by 1850 the United Kingdom was already about to reach the level where half of the population lived in cities and not in the countryside. And again, this was a shift which has proved unique in the history of mankind and in the history of each country. And Britain is the country that reached that level first. At the end of the 19th century, the growth of the urban population was still not over, but Britain kept a very significant advance. By contrast, France was, of the three richest countries in Europe, clearly the least urban of the three, which is something I have already introduced. But let's have a look more exactly at the factors and the process of this urbanization. So, in Britain, the shift from rural to urban was rather huge and sudden, and it was in practice a demographic change, because it was about the choices made by the population for their living environment. And so from countryside to cities, a massive process of rural-urban migrations took place, which was rather easily explained by the economic changes. Indeed, due to industrialization, more job opportunities were offered to the working class people, I mean the common people in fact, in cities, both small and big ones, while the less important but still existing impact of industrialization in the countryside resulted in a certain mechanization of farming, which meant that due to better machines, the arrival of better machines, and also better chemical techniques of fertilizing the lands and so on, well, the number of workers required in the countryside to produce food was decreasing. And this was also due to the fact that Britain had started to import a lot of food at that moment. In any case, for people living in the countryside, the job opportunities were clearly fewer than in cities, and that is the reason why it became a more widely spread idea and process to move from countryside to cities. To really understand why this was so clear in Britain, we must also speak about the fact that at this moment of the demographic history of this country, there was, like in the rest of Europe, but again more clearly, more intensively, a population boom. And so this population boom, combined with the fewer job opportunities, is what we call a situation of overpopulation, which means that the economy is not able to provide enough people with jobs and resources for a living. And so a solution to this problem of overpopulation is migration. In conclusion, what I have explained with the example of Britain here has been organized into a model which we call the push-pull model, which applies to the definition of two kinds of factors, two kinds of reasons that compelled many people to move from countryside to cities. The push factors being all the repulsive features that were present in the countryside that induced them to move away from this living place, and the pull factors being the attractive features that induce people to migrate to a certain destination, and in this example to cities. And this process was so massive and fast for Britain that for the 19th century we sometimes use the expression rural flight to refer to this big wave of migration. In French, the expression that is the translation of rural flight is exode rural. To explain this population boom that I've just mentioned, we must have a look at another model which is called the demographic transition model. In theory, because the graph I'm presenting now is theoretical, you can see on this graph two lines. The top line is the line of birth rate, the numbers of births in a population every year, and the line in black is the death rate. And during most of the history of mankind, in all societies, these two rates of birth and death have been very close to one another. In fact, pretty regular due to frequent epidemics or other problems that could affect the demography of some population. But overall, birth rate being slightly above death rate, you had a slow and regular increase of the total population. And from the late 18th century and mostly during the 19th century, the first big change that happened in many European populations, and firstly in Britain, was a drop in the death rate, which was permitted by the increase in living conditions, and notably in two sectors which were nutrition, thanks to improvements in farming, and hygiene. And during this time, the birth rate of the population did not decrease for two reasons. The first one being that thanks to the decrease in death rate, more children survived their early years, and so more young adults were present in the population, so young adults being the population category who's having children. And the second reason is that the habits, the behavior regarding fertility did not change as fast as death rate. It took a certain time for people to get used to the idea that less children would be a good idea. And only in a second stage, which is actually stage 3 on this model, did the birth rate start to decrease. And the consequence of this gap between birth rate and death rate is a big natural increase, so a big difference between the number of births every year and the number of deaths every year. And this is the reason why a population like the population of Britain during the 19th century did boom. The last stages of the demographic transitions being the situation that we are used to these days. We are living in that situation where both death rate and birth rate have reached low levels in some countries nowadays, like Japan, for example. even have a negative natural increase, or actually a natural decrease. But this is another story. So that's theory. In practice, what is remarkable is that, as you can see on the graph on the left, what happened in Britain was that not only did the death rate start to fall from the end of the 18th century, you can see the line in red, but it was combined with an increase in the birth rate. And this increase in the birth rate was notably due to the fact that, thanks to industrialization, it became obvious, even if it was not really true, that having more children would not be a problem, because the industry needed workers. And that's probably one of the reasons why the birth rate in Britain increased more than in many other countries. And that is the reason why the natural increase, so the difference between birth and death, and so consequently the population growth in Britain, was so big in the 19th century. So a real population boom in Britain. Now, as a comparison, France was remarkable for not experiencing a real population boom in the 19th century. Because as you can see on this graph, death rate and birth rate both decreased quite progressively and regularly during the 19th century. Clearly, there is a link between this and the contrasted economic situation of Britain and France. If the birth rate of French families decreased so progressively, it's probably because the country remained very rural. The farmers and their families were more used to the idea that if you have few children, then you will not divide the land of the family after the death of the father. And that's the reason why we can say the French Revolution also played a role, because the French Revolution gave more land to the French farmers compared to the situation in Britain, where the land was still owned by smaller numbers of very rich families. So here the contrast between these two countries, very close in geography but quite different from an economic, social, and so demographic point of view in the 19th century, this contrast is very, very clear. And so the maps that I already showed about France and Britain were very different. Of course, this map is not about population, but believe me if I tell you that in Britain, areas that did not used to be that much populated knew a real increase in their population thanks to industrialization. That is in particular the case of the south of Wales, the north of England, so I mean the region between Lancashire and Yorkshire, cities like Liverpool or Manchester, for example, with some cities like Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, Leeds or Glasgow that really boomed, shifting from being small cities to some of the biggest cities in Britain and actually in Europe. And so in Britain there was a real change in the population distribution in the country. That change was much less impressive in France, even though it's true that a region like the north of France or a region like Lorraine in the northeast, because they hosted the modern iron and steel industry, needed a lot of workers and so were attractive to migrants. In any case, France was still a country of farmers, not only in the middle of the 19th century but also at the end of this century. And the percentage of people living in the countryside remained above 50% until World War II in France. So that was very different process than the British process. So even though urbanization was slower in France than in Britain, in both countries, cities were changing fast, and cities were the places where change was the most obvious and the most impactful. I call this chapter Cities of Modernity and Poverty because alongside these changes from a traditional to a modern society, and also from a traditional to a more modern culture, cities were also places of extremely harsh poverty, in particular in Britain. That was really a social characteristic which would be remembered for a long time about Britain in the 19th century. This is what a very industrial city of the mid-19th century looked like in Britain. It's a landscape taken from Burnley, Lancashire. It's in the north of England, and well, that's one of the old photographs that could be taken in the middle of the 19th century. Photography was a new invention at that moment. They were a very polluted city. The smoke of the of the heating of each house and of the factories, of course, was particularly dense, and the living condition of the workers were very difficult because many of them lived in what we would call slums nowadays, because there was a housing crisis. The population of the cities was growing so fast that not anybody could be accommodated in a real house, even though many terraced houses were made near the factories, and they were very typical of these British cities of the period, and many of them are destroyed now, but you can still see them near the city center of many British cities. The problem of pollution was already something that was commented on in the press. You can see on this drawing on the left an innovative solution proposed by a cartoonist. And the observation of these conditions became something important in the cultural and political history of this country. Conditions of the working class were described and denounced by a couple of intellectuals in Britain. A famous book, which is what we would call today a sociological book, was made by a journalist named Henry Mayhew. The book was called London Labour and the London Poor. It was published right in the middle of the century, in 1851. But more famously, the novelist Charles Dickens became famous worldwide for his stories which depicted the life of the common working class people in Britain, with stories both taking place in the countryside or in cities, and often including a travel from countryside to cities all over Britain. One of the most famous of these novels is probably Oliver Twist, and the cultural impact of Dickens' novels was so big that Dickensian has almost become an adjective when describing a situation of great poverty and great concentration of working class people in a city somewhere in the world today. Another famous man who described the living conditions of the British working class, because he believed that this was something that had to be known and denounced and changed, was Frederick Engels. Yes, he was the friend and the co-writer alongside Karl Marx of the Communist Manifesto. And in Britain, he made a very big inquiry about the city of Manchester, and I've selected some quotes here where he described living conditions of the people in houses that look like what you can see on this old picture as well. And he writes, heaps of refuse and sickening filth are everywhere interspersed with pools of stagnant liquid. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about the streets, and they are just as dirty as the pigs which wallow happily on the heaps of garbage and the pools of filth. And talking about figures, he wrote, on average 20 people live in each of these little houses of 2 rooms, an attic and a cellar. One private is shared by about 120 people. So this kind of description is how a journalist would describe a very difficult slum in a big African city nowadays, for example. And in the meantime, in the big cities, and in particular in London and in Paris, where this was very obvious, there was also a concentration of wealth. A lot of money was being made there, a lot of wealth was being produced, and policies of urbanism aimed to modernize these cities with the construction of more houses, including some from the working class in Britain, the famous terraced houses. The train and the stations were built all over the countries, and in the big cities like London and Paris, underground train started to be built as soon as 1861 for London. You can see here a picture of that. And even Paris, the end of the century, Paris would be covered, or not covered is maybe not the best term, but the underground of Paris would be connected by a very dense network of underground railway lines. For France in particular, the government which remained famous for a very active policy of urbanism was the government of Napoleon III during the Second Empire. A famous name is the man in charge of the renovation, we would say rather redevelopment in English. The redevelopment of Paris was organized by a man named Baron Haussmann, and so we often talk about Haussmannisation for this set of changes that he introduced in Paris, destroying some of the most unhealthy working class districts of very old houses in the center of Paris and replacing them by more bourgeois blocks, creating a network of large roads in Paris, wide avenues, public parks, which triggered the beginning of a process in Paris where poor people became progressively rejected socially to the outskirts of the town because living in the center became too expensive, and rich people could come and live in Paris. It's a process that we call gentrification. It mostly took place in the west of Paris as opposed to the east, by the way. Same for London. The last point about these social changes it will also be connected to the political changes we studied in the first lesson. The emergence of this urban industrial working class, particularly important in Britain, was both a social change and also a political change, because as a community the working class formed a new political actor. So despite the machines and the steam engine, you must understand that the modern industry that was created by the first industrialization was very labor intensive. Labor intensive is an expression that refers to an industry which requires a lot of workers, a lot of hands, so very different from a high-tech industry, for example. In fact, huge factories were few. A great number of large workshops existed in Britain. And in all these workshops, in all these factories, the industrial working class was composed not only of strong men able to do very physical, difficult jobs, but also of women and children. The worker of the mid-19th century was a woman or a child. Okay, not only big men. This was nothing new in the sense that women and children already worked before that in more traditional societies in the countryside. School was not universal, labor regulation was very low, but in rural communities there was nothing like the very intense and very strict rules imposed on the workers by the capitalist businessmen, which really wanted the workers to cope with the impressive gains of productivity that was permitted by the machines. So it was difficult to work in these factories. People were paid very low wages. They were powerless in front of capitalists who had accumulated very big wealth and could replace the workers very easily because of the population growth. Moreover, in the British society, in the Victorian society of the 19th century, the idea that maybe the government and the public authorities should help the poor was not a very common idea, not at all. On the contrary, we can say that the economic liberalism of the Victorians was combined with a strong and strict social conservatism. And one of the famous expressions that was presented like a solution for society was called self-help. It was a topic and an expression notably used by a writer called Samuel Smiles, who made recommendation for society in a book in 1857, and he said that people should take care of themselves, and it was not society that should be caring about them, and certainly not the government. Some quotes from that man: "Whatever is done for men takes away the stimulus of doing for themselves." Okay, that's really a very not only individualistic idea, but it's also it's the kind of idea by which the British bourgeoisie was in fact preserving its socially privileged status. Another quote I will give you was a quote by Prime Minister of Britain in 1867. At the London Industrial Exhibition, he said, "Wealth is to a certain extent within the reach of all. You are competitors for prizes. You will be systematic industry. Raise yourselves in the social system of the country. You will acquire honor and respect for yourself and your families. Go on, ladies and gentlemen, and prosper." The idea that becoming rich was something possible for everybody is also an idea that the British bourgeoisie wanted to promote. Of course, due to the structure of the economy, this was greatly a lie. But the elite really insisted on promoting the idea that economic development would benefit everybody. In fact, exploitation was very intense, and the working conditions were particularly difficult, not only in the manufacturing industry, but also in the mines. It's not illustrated here, but you know that very well. The work in the mines of South Wales or Yorkshire was extremely difficult. In a way, workers were treated a bit like soldiers. They had to obey totally, and they had to work for very long hours, more than 12 hours a day, and keep the pace imposed by machinery. Of course, in case of accident, in case of physical accident in the factory or accident of life, like a disease or something, there was absolutely nothing given to the poor by the government, and nothing was imposed by law on the bosses in this social aid. But things would slowly change. Even if the the general mood of the government was that of being very harsh on the poor. Notably, we saw that previously in the lesson in lesson 1 about the workhouses, these houses where aid was given to people who were in need, but in fact these workhouses were extremely strict, and living in them was like living in a kind of prison. Well, progressively there was an organization of the workers, of the working class, very progressively of course, but they were concentrated in the same places, in the same cities, in the same districts in the cities. And so an identity, a social identity started to develop with a language, with cultural codes, and with a political organization. This is what we can call the labor movement, the movement in favor of the defense of the interest of the workers. It consisted of trade unions and political parties. Trade unions were these organizations of workers where they defended their interests in a specific factory, and more often in a specific craft, a specific job. And of course the political parties that defended the interest of the workers were the left-wing parties, which started to emerge progressively, but very progressively, because remember that the working class could not vote at that moment. So trade unions were the first to be created. And what is remarkable, and it's well illustrated on this poster from 1852, you can see that this poster is in fact a collaboration between several industries, several kinds of jobs forming one union. It's called the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, Machinists, Millwrights, Smiths, and Pattern Makers. And what you must understand and observe here is that it's not the poorest workers that became unionized first, that organized themselves to support themselves and to defend their rights. No, it was the better off of the working class, the most skilled, the most the less poor of the working class, because they were more educated, because they were more needed thanks to their skills, so they had gained a certain influence, and so they could weigh in what we call industrial relations, the relation between workers and managers and the authorities in general. As written by journalist Henry Mayhew in 1861, he wrote about the skilled worker: "The artisans are almost to a man red-hot politicians. They are sufficiently educated and thoughtful to have a sense of their importance in the state. The political characters and sentiment of the working classes appear to me to be a distinctive feature of the age." So journalist Henry Mayhew was describing this emergence of a union movement by the elite of the working class, we would say. Most of their actions were actions of petitioning, getting together, but also what they started to call strike actions, which meant trying to strike clearly, to impose something, to shock, and this was done by stopping their work for one day or more. There were already some general strikes in Britain, strikes all over the country by one category of workers or the other, notably during the Chartist movement that we studied in the previous lesson. Strikes were illegal, but they were done anyway by some courageous workers. Sometimes progressively government started to make them legal. In fact, it was in France that strikes were made legal for the first time by Napoleon III in 1864. And what is quite remarkable is to note that the French Revolution had not authorized strikes, because the French Revolution had been done by the young bourgeoisie. But yes, it was a big demand of the working class, and so Napoleon III, strange leader who did not want to be an enemy of the French working class in a way, made that legal. And this was made legal only in 1875 in Britain. Trade unions, in fact, were also illegal, and laws making them legal only happened after this lesson, after the chronology of this lesson, in 1871 for Britain, in 1884 for France. And it took a long time, it took many decades for the labor movement to manage to impose laws regulating labor, protecting the workers. The list is long, from the ban on child labor, which took place before 1850 in the two countries, to things that would appear to us as very common today, but for example, the fact that 1 day off per week is compulsory is something that was obtained by law in Britain only in 1890. So we have seen in this lesson two countries experiencing the most dramatic economic and social change in mankind's history, a real pathway to modernity, but again at a very contrasted pace. Britain was the first, and what happened in Britain was in a way at the vanguard of the social change that would happen to the rest of the world. It was the country of the Industrial Revolution. It was the fastest changing country in the world, with the exception of the USA, which was a new country in a way during this century, and Britain got a real economic leadership. France, which before industrialization used to be a stronger and more populated country than Britain, was more like a kind of old power which kept its strong rural base and was only beginning a shift to becoming industrial and modern, shift that would prove very, very progressive and much slower than the one in Britain.